So, Stephanie, welcome. It's great to talk to you today. Thank you for agreeing to be part of A Music Among Friends.
My pleasure.
So, you and I have known each other for a while now. You've lived in Durham for, I don't know, 20 some years. Is that
About 22 years, I think I added it up. Yeah.
So, and I've been here a little bit longer than that. So, obviously, we're both musicians and we're string players, so our paths have crossed. But a lot more recently, as I've kind of jumped down the rabbit hole of early period instruments, and that's of course one of the things that you are an expert in. I mean, that's your background, and that's what you've been doing for many years now.
Yeah.
As a musician. That's been your focus. And you are co-director of the Vivaldi project. Why don't you tell us a little bit kind of about your background, your degrees, and where you went?
Okay. Well, my early music degree is from Cornell University, and it's a degree specifically in 18th century performance practice. I think it's one of the few universities that offer such a degree. A lot of times there are Baroque performance practice degrees, but this one's specifically 18th century performance practice. And it's an unusual department, very small. And before that, I had gotten a master's degree from Indiana University. And as you will know, they have a really big early music program there. But I was not a part of that at the time. I did not want to do it. That was very clear in my head. I was not going to go down that rabbit hole. And then before that, I had been at Northwestern University.
And so after you got your master's degree at Northwestern, is that correct?
Well, at IU. I did undergraduate at Northwestern.
You were working in Chicago. This is what you told me. You were working in Chicago, and then you ended up being at Cornell. How did that happen?
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of these things. I look back on it, I'm not really sure how it happened. I had done this degree at IU, and IU was a huge department. I think there were 70 cellists when I was there, and I left really kind of confused, I think, about what this music world was. And I was living in Chicago, where I knew people from before when I had been at Northwestern, and I was freelancing and, I don't know, doing some temp work to make ends meet. And at some point I went and was a resident artist at Banff for about 6 months in between living in Chicago. And I was trying to really feel like, I don't know what was going to come next. How was I going to make this work? What was I going to say as a musician? And did I have anything to say as a musician? And somebody I knew said, oh, there's this program at Cornell, and they offer free tuition, and they give you a stipend. And the stipend was pretty much what I was making in Chicago. And I thought, what do I have to lose? There's one catch, though. I had to play an old instrument. But the focus was going to be on the music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, which always has been kind of my favorite period to live in. And I thought, I can do this. This sounds interesting. And good thing I didn't know what I was getting into, because I don't know that I would have taken it on.
Well, and then you met John Shu at Cornell. And John, many of us in this area know John because he lived here for several years before his death. We know him as a gambist and a Baroque cellist, and also as a conductor. But you had the opportunity to work with him at Cornell as your mentor, basically.
Yeah, I mean, he was my teacher, and I didn't know that much about him before I went, and boy, did I luck out. And when I got to Cornell at that point, it wasn't really about learning to play the cello. He taught me more about just music in general. And when I arrived, he was working heavily with the Apollo Ensemble, which was dedicated to playing the early Haydn symphonies. And so he was very steeped in that world. And the first thing I did was actually play the Haydn C major cello concerto with the chamber orchestra at Cornell. And I remember that first lesson where he just started talking about phrasing and how it worked in Haydn and how they combined and the character and the clues and the notation to all these things. And it was just like light bulbs, going off and aha moments. And I feel like that whole first month, my jaw was just permanently on the floor. I was learning so much. Um, and the amazing thing was that after I left Cornell, he then moved here with his wonderful wife, Martha, and they retired here. So then I got to have this whole history with him after that. So I feel really lucky.
And thanks to you and your introducing me to him, I also had an opportunity to work with him a bit before his death, and he's just such a evocative musician. I learned a lot just by watching him and being near him and listening to him speak about his interests and the way he approaches things, and it was really quite amazing. So, but at Cornell, so one of the things that you told me you did there was obviously you had to write a dissertation at some point, and you had to focus on something, and a kind of a correlation between music and language kind of caught your attention. And
well, yeah, and it was really an outgrowth of what my work with John and his approach to thinking about phrasing. And I thought, I really want to understand this. And one of the things that he gave me and that Cornell gave me was not so much this is how you should play it from somebody's perspective, but these are the tools that you can use. This is what we know. And then you use those parameters to then make your own music. And so it's actually a really powerful way of teaching somebody because you start to have the framework to build your own ideas. And we did a lot of research, and so I started looking at the subject of phrasing. This is the 18th century, and everybody's trying to write down exactly how things work and cataloging them, so especially the Germans. So there are lots of wonderful treatises and method books, and they all talk about phrasing. And what I started noticing was this analogy between phrasing in music and punctuation in language. And I kept seeing it. And like, for instance, there's a comparison between bad phrasing in language is like putting the comma in a sentence in the wrong place. And this is a common kind of example. So he lost his life, not comma, only his fortune. Now, if you put the comma in the wrong place, he lost his life, comma, not only his fortune. You've just killed him. So bad phrasing in music could be like death.
right.
And I encountered examples where there would be a minuet. In fact, I think it's on the cover of the book that I eventually wrote. There's a minuet, and it actually has colons and semicolons and commas in it, into the music.
In the music, so the music itself is punctuated.
Yeah. That when we approach phrases, they have the value of different points of punctuation. Yeah.
And there is the book, by the way. Music had punctuation, but we don't really see that necessarily nowadays in music. I mean, maybe we do to an extent that there are dynamics, but speak a little bit more about punctuation and what that does to a musical phrase.
Right. Well, we have a totally different understanding of phrasing in music today. We have a different aesthetic altogether. We play in different halls. We play actually instruments that are a little bit different. And so naturally, and who knows what comes first, but the music changes to adapt to our modern culture. And one of the things when I started seeing all these references to punctuation, I thought, why? Why are they talking about punctuation? And it turns out that punctuation at the time was a really hot topic in language. There was this movement towards elocution and getting up and being able to speak persuasively. And at the same time, people were reading novels, and the text that they were reading had to be able to convey the sound of the way we speak. And so there was this search for graphic tools that would enable people to read and speak and understand. And so punctuation was one of these tools. And not surprisingly, then the punctuation, if we're talking about it in language, it makes its way into music. And I think I'm sure this is still true today. Whatever our hot topics are, philosophically or language, they make their way into the way that we talk about music.
And so, things like songs that have lyrics punctuation may be a little more apparent in today's music as well as in, the 18th, 17th century. So how do you determine, what that punctuation is without lyrics?
Yeah, well, what I started to notice was that, well, first of all, the way I began by saying that the way we think about phrasing now is completely different than the way we think about it in the 18th century. This is both true of the way we speak and the way we play.
Okay.
And in fact, the way we play today is, in fact, the opposite to the way phrasing was thought about in the 18th century. And I won't get into details, but we're always very goal-oriented in the way we play now. And of course, I'm not making a judgment. This is just aesthetics. One is not better than the other. It's just the way things have evolved. So we tend to be very goal-oriented, and we work our way note by note to the high point and over and beyond. And 18th century actually comes from the opposite. It starts from the beginning and often even trails away and then starts again. And I found that 18th century sentences are kind of this way. They're very long. If you look at an 18th century sentence, it can be a paragraph long. It'll have maybe 2 semicolons in it, maybe a colon, at least 5 commas. So it's a lot of short units that you string together in a long sentence, and you do it through a sense of expectation, which is, I think, very different from the way we set things up today. We certainly don't write that way. Okay. So I have actually an example of an 18th century sentence, if you'd like to hear it. This is from Joshua Steele, who's actually a really interesting person. That's a whole other sidetrack. He tried to devise a system of using musical symbols to help us with language, which is, of course, kind of the reverse of what I was talking about with the analogy, but the same thing. And I love this example because it's an example not only of punctuation, but it's also an example of an 18th century sentence. So I'll just read it. Every sentence in our language, comma, whether prose or verse, comma, has a rhythmus peculiar to itself, semicolon. That is, comma, in the language of modern musicians, comma, it is either in common time or triple time, semicolon. The delicette, comma, minuet time, comma, or jig time, comma, or mixed, period.
That is a mouthful.
And of course, it has to be sprinkled with Latin because, it's an 18th century sentence. Right. And what I love about it is currently when we play, and I'm sure you've had this happen when you've rehearsed, everybody wants to make long lines, right? You want to make right. A long musical line, really go to the end. And this is just about the longest line you could imagine creating, but they get there in a totally different way. So there are these little pauses along the way of expectation. They're going to keep going. And what Steele has done is he's actually given it a meter, actually 2 different meters, and he's used musical notation to indicate almost eighth notes and quarter notes and things that we as musicians know. And he's given where the heavy accents are and the light accents are according to the meter. And he's put all of these signs in, and it's actually kind of awful to look at. If you really wanted to follow all of this notation, you would have to spend a lot of time to figure out how to use it. And this is also part of the story of musical notation in general, which is that any system, by definition, is going to use the fewest number of symbols possible for clarity. So you can't overload the score. In fact, we've seen what that happens, right? I think in the late 19th century, when they looked at Baroque and classical music, they said, oh, there's nothing here. And they put in all these crescendos and things to try and help you play it. And it just makes it almost impossible to play because there's so much to look at.
Right. And none of that was original to the music itself.
Right. And so what this, I think, also shows is that our notational systems are actually really good. We just have to learn how to read them and how to find what we have to add to them that's kind of not written but is implied. And when you learn to really speak the language, then you can see all of those things. And so that's what we do with musical language. We have to we have to add all kinds of stuff to it that's not there. And especially with this music from the 18th century, where there's often very little on the page, there's so much that's implied that you as a performer can bring to it.
And that's a personal thing, obviously.
Yeah.
And performers have to make decisions based on their knowledge and also their aesthetic preference. And you have a musical example actually to show us that.
Yeah, I do.
You're going to play movement of a Caporale sonata. And can you tell us a little bit about Caporale?
Yeah. Well, Caporale is one of these composers that we know very little about, and we really only know about him in his time in London. He was an Italian, and of course, Italians could gain more fame by leaving Italy and going to other capitals in Europe because everybody loved everything Italian. And he was one of Handel's favorite cellists. He wrote a lot for his own instrument. He wrote beautifully for it, and he's one of these early classical composers, and his music to me really represents this emerging style of kind of a clarity of phrasing, and yet at the same time it just weaves together so beautifully, and there's so much contrast from one phrase to the next, and it doesn't really look like it on the page. There are no dynamics. There's some ornaments, but no accents. There's nothing like a staccato mark to say, yeah, these notes should be played short and these notes should be played long. But of course, you can't play the whole thing without those variations. And what I love about this music is that not only can you bring all kinds of creativity to it, but you have to. And so every player who plays it is going to come up with kind of their own voice.
And what movement are we going to listen to?
This is the opening Adagio. I'm always drawn to the slow movements.
This cello sonata by Andrea Caporale has so much expressive variety in it. And yet, to look at it on the page, there isn't a whole lot there to guide us. There are no fortes or pianos or crescendos or decrescendos to indicate where we should get louder or softer. Other than some slurs indicating that a group of notes should be bound together, likely in one bow, there are no marks to say that certain notes should be on the shorter side or some notes on the longer side. It's up to us to find these expressive details. Right away, at the very beginning of the sonata, we have an example of where our modern sense of phrasing, developed from the late 19th century, is very different from the way phrasing was thought about in the 18th century. We have a 4-bar phrase divided into 2 2-bar segments. And then the second half. Now the question is, what do I do with the connective tissue between these 2 2-bar segments? It sounds like this. Now if I'm thinking in a modern way, I'm going to have that as a pickup leading forward. And if I'm thinking in an 18th century way, I'm going to do pretty much the opposite. And now, to my mind, that sounds like an 18th century sentence. I've created a kind of comma there, but with a sense of expectation going forward to the much longer sentence. And it's a wonderful nuance that both connects and separates, and I might not play it the same way every time. There's another passage that I really love. This is in the B section, where in the space of just 3 bars, we go from something really intense and articulated to a very songful answer that's still quite mournful. And then as the next phrase begins, everything is content and happy.
Well, thank you for that, Stephanie. That was lovely.
It's interesting doing these play along with yourself uh, kinds of videos. You have to actually play with a metronome while you're trying to make music.
Right.
And of course, that's a great skill, but most of us don't really want to be bound to a metronome. And I learned a lot in accompanying myself. I'm not always easy to follow. But it's fun. It's fun to try. It's fun to try both. I wouldn't want to only make music that way. That's for sure.
Well, and a lot of people are using that method right now because we can't be
What else
together.
can you do?
Right, exactly. So, after Cornell, you graduated. Where did you go? What did you do?
Well, I stayed at Cornell as long as they would let me and pay me. Although they were never more happy when I left. I think they always love it when their graduate students go off.
Right, of course.
But I had met my husband there, and he had gotten a job here at Duke in the math department, actually math and physics department. And so I moved here with him, and that would have been in about 97, I believe. And we've been here ever since.
And so one of the things that you've done since then is form an ensemble, the Vivaldi Project.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So this actually, the Vivaldi Project was created by Elizabeth Field, who had been at Cornell as well, but before me. So we did not actually overlap. But we worked together a little bit, and I knew her playing. And in fact, I was asked to run an instrumental element of the Duke Collegium in the music department. And I was told that I could bring a violinist down to work with the violin players. And so I called her up. And that was really when we started working together. And the Vivaldi Project evolved, and then when John came here, we did a couple of projects with him. We played all the C.P. Bach string symphonies with him, which was a true treat. That was amazing. And we started working with Alison Edberg Nyquist, violinist and violist. And should I get into string trios?
Yeah, I mean, so you guys have been working together, and at some point you you decided that there weren't enough really great recordings of so many, well, first of all, there are so many string trios from the early classical period that nobody knows about. And that's kind of now what you guys are focusing on. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Right. Well, this is an outgrowth of something from Cornell. I was speaking at some point to the Haydn scholar, James Webster, and he suddenly asked me, how come nobody plays Haydn string trios? And I don't know what I said, but I probably tried to pretend that I knew what he was talking about, which I didn't. I thought, oh, Haydn string trios. I'm going to remember that. And I didn't do anything about it then, but then as Liz and Allison and I were working together and playing a lot of Baroque music, I thought, it's time. It's time to see if there are more string trios other than these 18 that Haydn wrote. And I started digging, and I couldn't believe what I found. There are thousands of string trios, and I stumbled across this amazing fact, actually written about Haydn trios, but about trios in general, which is that from about 1750 to 1770, more string trios were published than string quartets by a ratio of 5-1.
Why was that, do you think?
Well, they were incredibly popular. I think they're an outgrowth of the Baroque trio sonata.
Right.
2 melody lines and a bass. And it was this really flexible medium to explore all kinds of writing, concerto writing, symphony writing. It was very popular. And also maybe 3 players, financially easy to put together if you're on a budget. You need a quick performance. Something that could be enjoyed at home, maybe. Although a lot of it's not really amateur style writing. Some of it is, but a lot of it is not. It's very serious. But eventually the string quartet was a more successful medium. 4 voices is easier to write for, it's easier to play. And it eventually took over. And I think because we have so many wonderful string quartets, especially by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and then everybody who came after, there wasn't the need to look at a lot of the string quartets even that were written by some of the more obscure composers. And most of the string trios are 18th century composers that, while they were really popular in their own day, we don't really know about them now.
And you've embarked on a project to record a lot of these trios. Can you talk about some of these composers that you've kind of unearthed recently?
Well, yeah, and of course I haven't really unearthed them. They were there all along, and
of course,
and with things like IMSLP, we have so much access to what libraries all over the world have. But I have done some writing off to libraries, asking for trios, and then I make Allison and Liz read them, and we decide which ones we like. But we've recorded 2 CDs, and we're actually about to go record our 3rd. I think we can do that safely. So Giardini is a wonderful sort of getting towards late 18th century composer. Cannabich, who Mozart knew. One of our favorites is Campioni, who was somebody Jefferson championed. He collected a lot of his music, which is why we have it. And he wrote wonderful music for string trio. I think one of our favorites, though, is J.C. Bach. And when we first read, there are a set of 6 trios that I found actually on a microfilm in the Duke Library. And when we read them, we thought, yeah, they're nice. Maybe there's one movement that could be an encore. That's the D major trio. And then we sort of came back to them and started to realize what was really there. And I think that's part of the story of why the string trio isn't known, is that it's written in this 18th century language that if you just play it and you don't bring to it what you need to, in terms of an understanding of phrasing and the complexity of the notation that is there but doesn't look like it's there, it really is, yeah, it's pretty, it's nice, but it's not all that interesting. But in fact, it really is. I have so much respect for J.C. Bach as a composer. I think he's incredibly important, and the music is wonderful.
And so obviously you need to work together as a trio to bring it to life. and to make decisions about how it's going to be played, so that it makes sense in the vernacular that you have as a string trio.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about what we can do, to that set of quarter notes, to make them really vibrant, and how does this phrase answer this phrase, and yeah, we spent a lot of time. I think anyone listening to us might think we were a little bit crazy.
Well, no, I think musicians in general are very detail oriented.
Yes.
And that's just the nature of the beast, and that's how you are successful. So we're going to hear two movements of J.C. Bach trios. Can you introduce them a little bit, or?
Yeah, so the D major background? The D major one is the one we thought, might make a good encore piece. And that movement is really fun. And the thing we love about it the most is how fast Allison has to play. And she does it so well. But it's just the jolliest of pieces. And J.C. Bach at the time, he had lost his father, and he was in Italy for the first time kind of on his own. And he had fallen in love with opera. And you could just feel his zest for life. He was in a new phase of his life. He's the youngest son. He's exploring all these new things. He also converted to Catholicism. So he's breaking the family mold in a lot of ways. And it's just full of life. The G major one is, to us, in a way, the most conversational. In fact, Liz nicknamed it the WW trio. Because she says WW, and then WW, WW. And it really is, it's all of those little nuances make it work.
All right, we're going to listen to both these movements. And Stephanie, I want to thank you very much for being part of this interview and speaking to our audience and giving us some insight to 18th century music, punctuation, and I am personally so grateful for all the help you've given me, personally, towards my journey playing the Baroque viola, which has not been an easy one, and it's definitely
it's not an easy thing.
It's new and exciting and challenging, and you've really helped me out a lot, and so I'm very grateful. And so we're going to listen to some J.C. Bach, and thank you again for being willing to be interviewed and speak to us.
Thank you, and thank you for all that Mallarmé music does for our community.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.